Hi, this is the Unit 1 review. I'm hoping this will help you prepare for your retake. To start off, we're going to look at the Magna Carta, the Petition of Right, and the English Bill of Rights. I think the most important things for you to know about these documents is that they set up our modern-day government by introducing three key ideas. Limited government, the idea that the government can't do whatever it wants. There are limits to what it can do and what powers it has over its citizens. The rule of law, that everyone, including members of the government, have to follow the law, including the king or the president, him or herself. And then lastly, that there are individual rights. So there are certain rights that you get just by being a citizen and living in that country just from breathing oxygen, like freedom of speech or freedom from cruel and unusual punishment, and that everybody should get those things. There are some key features to the Articles of Confederation that are important for you to understand. They needed supermajorities to pass any bill. Like they needed 9 out of 13 votes. That's a supermajority. If you notice in our current Constitution, you only need supermajorities for a couple of key things. Because the idea is that we wanted to move away from that mistake from the Articles. They needed all of the states to agree to pass an amendment. Again, in our current Constitution, you only need 3/4 of the states. It gave very little power to the national government, and that meant that the national government didn't have some of the key powers that it needed in order to be successful. Like it didn't have the power to regulate trade between the states. It didn't have the power to collect taxes. Heck, it didn't even have the power to have a national currency. And those things really made the Articles of Confederation eventually unsuccessful. The key reasons why the Articles of Confederation failed really fall into one category, which is economic crisis. Congress didn't have the tools it needed to deal with the crisis. They couldn't regulate trade between the states. They couldn't pay their own bills. They couldn't raise the money to pay their own bills, and that was causing a lot of problems. Really, the last trigger, or sort of the last straw, before we had the Constitutional Convention was Shays' Rebellion, where farmers were upset that they were losing their farms, and they rose up against the Massachusetts state's government. And what we had was a battle between Massachusetts versus Massachusetts. And it was different during the American Revolution because we were shooting at the British. But here we had Americans shooting Americans, and that really made people feel like, okay, this government isn't functioning. And so at that point, let's get something done so that we can have a functioning government and we don't actually have to have anarchy and chaos and people in the country fighting against each other. At the Constitutional Convention, there were two key plans that came up in the debate, the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. Fundamentally, the issue is a federal versus a Confederate system. Right? The Virginia plan was putting forth a federal plan that had more power given to the national government, whereas the New Jersey plan was sort of tweaking with the Articles of Confederation and was leaning a little bit more towards a Confederate system. How the people would be represented was another difference. In the Virginia plan, the states with the highest populations were going to get more of a vote, whereas in the New Jersey plan, all the states would get the same vote regardless of how many people lived there. And then lastly, the difference was who favored the plans, right? The Virginia plan was obviously much more advantageous to the larger states, like the state of Virginia, whereas smaller states were more preferential to the New Jersey plan because they were afraid that they weren't going to have any power under the new government. There were some key compromises that were made at the Constitutional Convention that made things able to move forward. The first compromise that happened was called the Connecticut Compromise, or sometimes called the Great Compromise. And what it does is it sets up our modern-day Congress. The House of Representatives is used as proportional representation from that Virginia plan, where the larger states get more votes than the smaller states. So California gets the most votes, but everybody gets one vote in the House of Representatives, even little South Dakota. The Senate in the Great Compromise represents our Senate today, which looks like what they were talking about under the New Jersey plan, which is that every state had the same vote, right? So every state in our country, regardless of whether they're California or South Dakota, gets 2 votes. The thing that sort of clinched the deal for the Connecticut Compromise was it specifically gave the powers of the purse, right? Who gets to make monetary decisions? Who gets to pass bills that deal with money to the House of Representatives, because of course the states with more people would be also putting in more money. This then led to the next debate, which is, okay, well, if we're going to have one house that's based on population, how are we going to count the people? And that sets up for the Three-Fifths Compromise. What it does is it legalizes slavery, which is the first problem, which we don't get to change until the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments about 100 years later. But what it means is that southern states get to artificially inflate their people because they count every 3 out of 5 slaves towards their population count, even though they do not give them the rights of citizens. This, of course, changes after the Civil War. Now, during the Constitutional Convention, we don't have political parties, but the battle royale that happens afterwards sort of sets up our first political parties that happen in the United States. And so people quickly divide into 2 camps, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists are pro-federal government. They are pro-Constitution. They are definitely anti the Articles of Confederation. They are very concerned about having a weak national government, and they really want to have economic progress. They really want to have the economy stable, and they want the United States to become a more stable country. The Anti-Federalists felt excluded from the Constitutional Convention. They felt like it was an undemocratic process. They were very concerned about having this strong national government. They felt like stronger state governments was a better way to go because it would protect them from having a dictatorship. They particularly feared this idea of having a president because they felt like the president was going to become a king, like a king version 2.0, and they demanded a Bill of Rights. Now, of course, the Anti-Federalists lose this battle because the Constitution is ratified and does become the document that we still use today in the United States, but they do win a battle. They win this battle for having a Bill of Rights, and that is enacted within the first 10 years, I believe, after the Constitution is passed. One of the key principles that's set up in the Constitution is this idea of judicial review. And the first place it is tested is in Marbury versus Madison. The Supreme Court says that they are the final arbiter. They're like the referee. So if the Congress and the president are having a fight, they are the ones who have the power constitutionally in order to determine who's right and who's wrong. And it's because they are the ones who get to sort of be the referee on this question of the Constitution. Another case that demonstrates this idea of judicial review is U.S. v. Nixon. In U.S. v. Nixon, the House was investigating the president, and they wanted the president to turn over his tape so they could see whether or not the president did or did not have knowledge of the Watergate break-in. Mr. Nixon said no, he didn't have to give them over to the House. He was the president, and he had executive privilege. And again, when you have this conflict between the Congress and the president, boom, the Supreme Court gets to decide. And the Supreme Court sided with Congress and said that they, as a part of their power to investigate the president for impeachment, they had the right to have this information. And then he did turn over the tapes because the Supreme Court said he had to, but then he resigned. And both of these are examples of judicial review. Judicial review being the power that the Supreme Court has to decide at the end of the day whether or not an action from another branch or from another level of government is or is not constitutional. Now, we've had to make changes over the course of the 200 plus years of the United States' Constitution, and there is an official process by which to actually make a change to the written document itself. First, Congress has to propose a change, and it has to be passed by both the House and the Senate by a 2/3 margin, meaning that you have to have a supermajority that agrees that it's a good idea. Then it goes to the states, normally through the state legislatures, and 3/4 of the 50 states have to say, yes, this is a good idea, and they normally get a window of about 2 years to make that decision. And the Bill of Rights, all of the first 10 amendments, went through this process. And as a matter of fact, 26 out of our 27 amendments went through that process. Now, we can also make an informal amendment. We can change the Constitution without changing it written. And judicial review, which I already talked about, is probably the best example for you to use on the test. In the document, it does not say in the Constitution that the Supreme Court has the power of judicial review. It alludes to it, but the Supreme Court in the Supreme Court decision of Marbury versus Madison says clearly we have the power of judicial review. And we have all acted for, over 200 years now like the Supreme Court does have that power of judicial review. And that's what an informal amendment is when you basically change your understanding of the Constitution, even though you don't change the wording of the Constitution. There are other ways to informally change the Constitution, like through party practices, executive actions, or legislative action, or customs. But I think it's best for you to go into the test with one key example, and I'm picking judicial review. There are types of powers that you need to master and understand for the unit exam. And the first is we're going to compare express powers versus reserved powers. Express powers are things that are expressed directly or delegated specifically in the Constitution to the national government, like the power to declare war or the power to coin money. Those things are it's directly stated, boom, right there in the Constitution. Hey, you, national government, you get to do this. Reserved powers are things that are laid out in the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment says that powers that are not directly stated in the Constitution should be given to the states, and they specifically lay out things like issues of health and safety should be left to the states. Generally, things that are left to the states are things like licenses, like, for example, teaching licenses, educational requirements. Those types of things are left to the states. The other type of comparison I want to make here are exclusive powers versus concurrent powers. Exclusive powers are things that are only given to the national government, like foreign policy. The state of Texas isn't going to come up with its own foreign policy with Mexico. We have one policy with Mexico, and it's decided by Washington, D.C. So exclusive powers are things that are just given to the national government. Concurrent powers are powers that are shared by the national government with the state governments. So, for example, the power to tax. Next week, I've got to pay my federal taxes, and I'm going to pay taxes to the state and taxes to the federal government because it's a concurrent power. Implied powers come through the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution. Implied powers have to be tied directly to an expressed power. So in the Constitution, it says that an expressed power is that Congress has the power to raise an army. So during the Civil War, the Congress said, wow, we don't have enough people to have an army. So they decided to use the power to draft. They forced people through conscription to join the U.S. Army. Now, there was a court case and went to the Supreme Court, and they said, hey, if you look at the Constitution, it doesn't say that Congress has the power to draft people. And the Supreme Court said, no, it doesn't say it directly, but it's implied. And they said this is a legitimate expansion of the national government's power because it's tied specifically to an expressed power. Lastly, inherent powers are powers that you have to have in order to have a country or a functioning government. And I think the best example of this is you have to be able to control your borders. Because if you can't control your borders, pretty soon someone else is going to take you over. Now, the United States has set up a federalist government, right? We use federalism, which means that the national government has power, the states have power, and we share powers. Over time, our balance of how much power the national government gets to have versus how much government the states get to have has changed and shifted. So for the first, up until about the early 1900s, up until about the 1930s, we had what's called dual federalism, which is that the national government had its things it was in charge of, the state had its things it was in charge of, and they didn't interact with each other. They were two separate spheres, and they didn't interact or cooperate with each other. But in the 1930s, under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, we had the New Deal program, and the national government wanted to get people back to work and wanted to decrease unemployment. And so what FDR would propose is that Congress would start these national projects like the WPA, and then they would put people to work in the states, and they would give the states the money and actually carry out the projects. And so it was a national government, state government partnership. And so this separate spheres thing ended, and now there was a blurring of lines between the national government and the state government. This period continues until about the Nixon administration in the 1970s, where we start to have the federal government say, hey, why do we have to give all this money to the states and where some state governments start to say, hey, why do we have to take orders from the national government all the time? So we have this pushback, and we are currently in this new period called New Federalism, where there is increasingly a debate about whether or not the federal government and state government should cooperate on things. However, we are not back to the period of dual federalism, because the fact is that the national government has gained a lot of power, and I don't think we're going back to a period where we have that complete separation. It is also important for you to review key terms from the chapters for your unit, for your review of your test. However, if you did well on the matching section on the test originally, you will not be required to retake that section of the test, but it would be something that would be helpful for you for the retake to just remind yourself about these terms so that you could use them in your short answer, or so that if these words were used in your short answer, it didn't trip you up. I hope this review has been helpful, and I hope that you will be well prepared for the next Unit 1 test, and I hope you're going to nail it. Thank you.